Welcome back, Nicole Heel. Great to have you on the show again. So today what we're going to do is do the great debate, and that is an age-old question, shares versus property. The only problem for you, though, is you'll be doing both sides of the debate.
Okay. I'll be able to argue with myself all day. Fantastic.
Absolutely. So look, I'm sure most listeners would be aware of the share market and what it is, but can you give us a bit of just a brief rundown? We will be doing a future episode all about the share market itself, but just give us a brief rundown about what it is and how it works.
Yeah, well, the share market the market, they call it sometimes. The market is basically it's a bundle of companies, publicly listed companies that you can buy shares in. So that's why they call it the share market. Sometimes they call it the equity market or the stock market. All those words mean the same thing. We just like to confuse people with different, terminology. But yeah, so you are buying a share in a company, and then the share market is the aggregate, basically all the companies available to buy shares in. So I don't know whether I can make that sort of any.
No, absolutely. And obviously you can.
Sorry?
I was going to say, obviously you can buy it in different industries as well, and all those companies make up those different industries.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll just sort of say, just as a sort of a way of explaining the share market, when you listen to the news, they call it the ASX 200. So that gives you an indication of what. So the ASX is the Australian Stock Exchange, and the ASX 200 are the top 200 companies in Australia listed on the stock exchange. So that kind of gives you an overview, and you can buy shares in all different industries. So basically, if you can see a brand, if you see a brand in front of you, it's probably more likely than not that it's a listed company. As Qantas is a company and a brand. You can buy a share in Qantas, Woolworths, Coles, all of those sort of, Myers, all that sort of stuff. So it's basically companies that you buy. You buy a part of a company, and then the share market is all the companies, Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, that makes perfect sense. And when we look at the property market, I'm sure most people are familiar with you buy a house or a unit, or you can buy an investment property. But what are some of the other types of property that you can invest in other than just your standard sort of house and unit?
Oh, there's a few. Oh, well, you can buy commercial property, but I just want to say now, I'm not a property advisor. So just the information I'm giving you now is really just very general to do with property versus shares. But commercial property you can buy, but all property advisors I've spoken to said you'd want to have at least 6 or 7 residential property before you'd look at commercial. And commercial is, the retail stores on high streets, and the buying into hotels or shopping centres and things like that. So you can buy serviced offices, those kind of things. There are ways of buying those sort of commercial properties that you don't buy them directly. They're called REITs in Australia, and that's real estate investment trusts. So you can actually get into the market and buy a diversified portfolio of commercial sort of property, but you have it managed by someone else, and that's actually the best way to get into any sort of commercial property, because it's a lot. You can buy a lot smaller amounts, and you can think about the commercial properties. You've got a lot of debt. The problem with property is usually a lot of debt attached to it, so it's a risky situation with the debt on top of it. So I think people consider that property is less risky because they can see it, they can touch it, they can walk through it, they can, it makes sense. Whereas the share market is a little bit more sort of, it's a ticker tape or it's something on the TV. You don't really see it, But the property market is more sort of a tangible asset, I suppose. But you can get yourself in all sorts of trouble with property just because people take on too much debt when property is involved. So I think that's really the difference.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. And you have people, people get quite passionate about it, don't they? You have the property advocates who swear black and blue that property is better, and the same thing for the share market advocates. So if you're asked you and your general opinion, what do you think, shares versus property?
Well, It's funny. I did a shares versus property debate for Vic Superwomen Money series years ago, and we had this conversation. And it really, it's going to sound annoying, but it does depend on your circumstances. So I think property. I'll give you a couple of reasons why property is getting harder and harder, and it is because it's getting so expensive, and it's becoming ridiculous in Australia. There is an index. What is it called? I'm just going to. Annual Demographia International Housing Affordability Survey. There's a couple of big words there. 2017, the least affordable properties in the world, and Hong Kong was the first, Sydney was the second,
Wow.
Vancouver was the third, San Jose was the fourth, and Melbourne was the fifth.
Wow.
Yeah,
2 out of 5. Wow.
2 out of 5, and not only that Australia has the worst housing affordability in any nation outside of Hong Kong. There were so they call it affordable market is if your property is about 3 times your gross annual household income. That's the sort of where they say that's the affordability range.
Wow.
So that's around about 3. Sydney was 12.9 last year, and Melbourne was 9.9. We have throughout all of our metropolitan markets, our median multiple 6.6, so it's twice as expensive as the what they call an affordable standard of 3 times your annual household income. So people have to understand that things have changed. I mean, in the 80s, every market except from Sydney was around about 3. 3 times the median income, and it just has skyrocketed. So. So I'm a mortgage broker as well, so I deal with those sides. I deal with getting the debt organised for the property purchases, and I've seen some crazy prices out there. So generally speaking, if property was affordable, I wouldn't have a problem with it, but I don't think that you're getting the best value anymore by buying property. Having said that, if you bought property 5 years ago, especially in Sydney, I don't know what the returns have been like, about 60% or something, depending on where you bought. So it can create a really good capital for you, but you have to be aware of the costs and everything else. Yeah. And the difference between shares and property is that shares you can buy and sell little parcels of. So you can. If you got into any sort of trouble, if you lost your job or something like that, and you had a portfolio of shares that was worth, I don't know, let's say 50,000 just for something to say, you could go and say, well, I need to grab $5,000 back. I need to use that to cover my living expenses. Now, if you had a property, you would actually have to sell the whole property. So the differences in between the liquidity of both of those things is on 2 sides of the scale. To get a property on the market, we've all, you've seen it. If you haven't done it before, you will have seen somebody that's done it. You've got to get it on the market. You've got to get it advertised. You've got to get it sold. You've got to wait for settlement and all those things. With a share portfolio or with managed funds, or a managed fund, I'll just go explain a managed fund. A managed fund is actually a combination, is a parcel of shares that somebody else manages for you. So, but you can sell those. I mean, it takes 2 or 3 days for the transaction to be done and hit your bank account. So you can get yourself out of a lot of trouble with shares. Yeah. They do appear to be more volatile, and the difference I'll just sort of explain that, is that talking about the changes in property and the share market, the changes in the share market over the last maybe 30 years or so is that everybody's got internet access now. So, if something goes wrong somewhere, it can be like a wildfire through the whole property the whole share market, and that's globally. So that has created a lot of much more volatility, and people people did have some debt in the share market. So the global financial crisis was people sort of in Australia, we sort of got away with it a little bit, but the people with shares probably saw more of a downturn than the people with property. So, and these things stick in people's minds. So I think that the pros and cons are they're quite different, and you need to have a fair bit. I mean, with property, you need to have about you need a 20% deposit before you pay loan mortgage insurance to the banks too. Yeah. So trying to get a 20% deposit in a Sydney apartment these days
is difficult. So if we recap and look at those two areas of liquidity, or how easily you can turn the asset into cash, and volatility. So we're saying that shares generally a higher level of liquidity, so you can just sell them and get your cash. And from a volatility perspective, or how quickly or rapidly the price may vary over time, we're saying that shares tend to have a greater volatility than property. Okay.
Definitely. Yeah.
And we spoke a bit about cost of entry as well. So obviously with the property market, you need a large amount of cash for that deposit, whereas with shares, I mean, you can probably a couple of $100 if you wanted to, you can invest.
Yep, you can start with whatever you want, really. And managed funds, I think around about minimums, maybe it's $500 or something, and then you can actually you can have a savings account and you can put $100 a month in. You know, they're pretty small starting points. The other thing with property is that you've got to pay a stamp duty, so that's a killer. So I always say to people, it's 25. You need 25%, so 20% for your deposit. If you don't want to pay loan mortgage insurance to the banks, which can be thousands of dollars, and then you need about 5%. Well, in Victoria, and I know all states are different, some unknown reason, but they are, that you would need to pay stamp duty. So it's usually just under 5%, plus then you pay, conveyancer, and you need to, if you buy property, you should have a building inspection, you should have a pest inspection. You've got to look at the contracts, and you've got to look at, if you're buying something that's not freestanding, you've got to look at the body corporate. So there's a lot of stuff that you've got to do. So so those costs of entry are much higher in property than they are in shares, and also cost of exit as well. So you've got to put your property on the market. The real estate agents will take a percentage, or I don't know what they do, or they'll be different, but they'll take some money off your tap. A couple of percent normally. So they are the big differences.
Okay.
And you can't. The other thing that I think is a big difference is, the diversification factor. You can't diversify unless you're really, really wealthy. How do you diversify a property portfolio very well? I mean, you've got to have a lot of money to be able to have a diversified portfolio of property, and whereas in the share market you can't. So diversification means not putting all your eggs in one basket. I'm sure everyone's heard that, but and why you diversify is because what happens is you reduce the risk, and without reducing the return. That's actually the reason why you diversify. So the fact is that money sort of moves from one market to another, and the share market normally performs when the share market's performing well, the property market doesn't perform as well. When the property market's performing well, the share market doesn't perform as well. Then there's a cash cycle in the middle of that. So when cash is king, and that was after the GFC, if anyone remembers that, you could get 6 or 7% return on your cash. So why would you take any risk on anything else? So so diversification means having a little bit of money in all your different markets, and then you don't have to start trying to time these things. And
so I guess if you're looking at diversification, I mean, like you said, if you buy one house, that's going to take up all your capital, or a large part of it. And if they decide to put a freeway beside your house, you're sort of a bit in trouble there. Whereas with shares, if you had X amount of money, you could buy multiple different companies. So if something did happen to one of those companies, the other ones will probably be going okay. So it would probably more than offset them.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why you do it. So, I mean, you're not going to pick a winner every time. Nobody does. So anyone that tells you that they're going to just walk away, because they're
quietly walk away.
Just walk away. But yeah, so that's the thing. So if you've got 10 or 20 different shares, or 20 different managed funds, or whatever it is, not all of those are going to be performing all at the same time. Some will perform better than others, and then you can have you look at your portfolio and make a decision on whether you want to keep the ones that are underperforming, or you're buying in. Maybe, it depends how you're investing, but you might be buying in when the market's down, with the hope that it's going to increase over a few years. So you've got it's completely different personalities, these two investment strategies. And the other thing I should point out, that buying a house to live in is not an investment. That's the house to live in. So what that does is, if you can only afford to buy one house, that you want to live in, then that's sort of taken up your money towards that. If you're talking about property as an investment, it's actually the house that you're not living in. So it's an investment that's creating an income for you. So that's really where we sort of differentiate between,
So obviously we're investing to try and make a return on it. So when you look at capital growth and income as two separate things, how do both of those things tend to fare with property versus shares?
Yeah. So, well, capital growth, historically it's quite similar. If you look at some graphs that sort of over a long period of time, they do seem to sort of tend to work quite in sync with each other, or not in sync, but along the averaged return is quite similar. So the capital growth is, I probably won't make too many comments on that. I think there's not a lot in it as far as I'm concerned. The income is a bit different. With properties, your income is taxed. Your income from your properties is put onto your income tax and taxed at your marginal tax rate. Obviously, you have tax deductions and things with properties that we could probably get into in a second. But you don't get the income with any tax advantages. Now, the income with shares, and we're talking about Australian shares now, you don't normally get a lot of income off foreign. You can, but foreign shares. We're talking about Australian shares at the moment.
Yeah.
The income, they call it a dividend. So you might have heard the word dividend before, dividend yield. People will get a dividend payment from their shares, and that includes a franking credit. So you've got a tax benefit. You've already paid 30% tax on your income from your shares. So you're actually getting a better tax effective income from a share portfolio than you are from a property portfolio. So that is a difference there.
Okay. Yeah. But I guess the flip side to that, though, is if you had an investment property and it was negatively geared such that the costs of your borrowing costs are higher than your rent you're receiving, obviously there's tax advantages for that as well. So there is tax advantages for both, I guess.
Well, there are, but the difference is that you don't have a debt. You're not so negative gearing. You pay, just to make it really simple, is that you pay $3. You get $3 and you've got to pay you've got to pay more out than you're actually getting in. Whereas the dividend with the share is and that's how you get your tax deduction, is that you're actually paying more out than you're getting in. So there's a loss. Whereas the income on your shares, there's no loss. It's just being taxed differently. So there are tax benefits. I mean, there's tax deductions with negative gearing, but you're still paying out more than you're making. So that's what the difference is there.
So I guess when we look at both shares and property, there's pros and cons for each. And would you suggest that in the ideal world, you're probably better off having a little bit of both, right?
Oh, look, if you can afford to do that, I mean, I think it's, just running through those numbers again that we did earlier, when we are, and just apart from talking about Sydney and Melbourne being in the top 5, none of the other capital cities are affordable either. So they're actually severely unaffordable based on what we're making. So it's all relative to your income coming in. So I think we need to just take a look and just make sure that you're not trying to get into an investment that is actually going to create stress and strain on your lifestyle, your relationships and things like that. So if you're going to buy, I mean, there's something about they call it rent vesting now. That's a little word that's been made up. So if you can't afford to buy a house to live in, but you'd like an investment property, then you could rent somewhere and buy an investment property. You might be able to buy a 1-bedroom apartment or a 2-bedroom apartment, or buy somewhere in a different capital city. I would highly recommend that you see a property advocate when you're buying property, because people buy just as bad property as people have problems with share markets when they crash. I've seen a lot of trouble and people not being able to sell properties when the markets have changed, not being able to refinance because things have moved around, and that's really happening at the moment. So I think you need to be careful. They're both long-term strategies. Don't ever get into any investment thinking that it's a short-term strategy. You should be at least a 7 to 10 year strategy for either of those things. So because time's the magic ingredient. With we talked about compounding interest and time being the magic ingredient. That's really all it is. But you need to have a certain amount of time. And with the property market, the actual massive costs of getting in and out of the property market will chew away a lot of your profits. So you need to sort of sit on it for a while. So don't buy anything you can't afford comfortably. And if you can't afford to buy property, don't worry about it. Just don't think it's the only thing you can do. You can buy, like I said, you can go and have a look at retailers, real estate investment trusts called REITs, which you can buy like a managed fund. So you can put $500 in start with 500, add 100 each, that sort of thing. Or you can do the same with managed funds for share markets. And the other thing about share markets, I was sort of talking about Australian share market, but the reality is Australia is only 2% of the world's market. And so the real benefit of the share market that I see for people is that you need to also be diversifying outside of Australia and getting some money into other countries. So obviously Australia is really, we're not a tech company, we're not a manufacturing company, so there's these massive, there's a lot of industries that we don't even have any access to from the Australian market. So you need to get money across into other markets as well. And that share market is it's a lot easier to do that with a small amount of money, and you don't have to have any debt against it as well if you don't want to.
I remember we spoke in the superannuation episode around that investing in the foreign markets. That's it's crazy, isn't it? 2% of the world market. So we really are a little fish in a big pond.
Yeah, and just think about it. Just how I sort of explain the share market is that, all the brands that the iPhones, the Apples, and the the cars that you drive, and the clothes that you wear, and all that sort of stuff. They're usually coming from a company that's related to the share market. So, and you can't imagine that 2% of we are such a, because we're so isolated from the rest of the world geographically. I think sometimes we think we are, self-sustaining, but we're not. We need the rest of the world and the rest of the industries and imports and exports and all this sort of stuff. So you definitely do need to look at outside Australia, and the best and easiest way to do that is to look at some managed funds or some ETFs. Or I won't go into that. We'll go into that in another episode, but. You need to, and that's diversification as well.
Absolutely. So you're exactly right. We'll go into that in another episode. I guess the thing that I've taken from this is I have a saying that you need to swim in your lane, and when you look at shares versus property, there's enormous amount to consider. So people should really think about getting some professional advice around this. So if someone wanted to get more information about you, to see you, or just about these areas in general, what can they do?
So if you want to have a chat with me, you can. My website's called Nicole Heals Financial, and I have a Facebook page, an Instagram page, and a LinkedIn page. So you're very welcome to connect with me in any of those social media or my website. Get on my newsletter list. Give me a call. My number's on my website, and look at the other thing that I would recommend. And I say this at every episode. Look at the Money Smart website. I hope if I say it often enough, people will do it. There's a lot of stuff on shares versus property, and super versus your mortgage repayments. What is superannuation? What's property? What does it all mean? What's negative gearing? Google's a great thing. There's books out there too, but I think you do. I don't actually, if I see clients, I try and direct them towards a property advocate, because they're in that market space all the time, and they charge a fee. But what they do is they negotiate, they find the property, and they negotiate the price or go to auction and things like that. But they usually cover their costs by getting you a better deal than you could have got yourself. And even if you go to them for some experience around where to buy, what not to look for, so even, if you need some help, first point of reference, maybe give me a call or contact me, and then I can put you in contact with other people. I can't list names over the, podcast with a million different contacts, but I'd be happy to put you in contact with other people. And
perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. And we've actually got another episode coming up in a little while, specifically around property. And as I said, we'll get you back on around shares. So I guess if you look at the outcome of this, the shares versus property, I think the answer is it depends.
Yeah, I know, and it's annoying when people sort of
Sit
when
on
I
the
did
fence.
this last. Well, it's not. It's going to depend on your personality type, and your affordability. But I suppose what I want to say, don't think that property is the safest thing that you can do, because that's not necessarily the case. And don't think shares are scary, because they're not. You just need some. Usually, fear comes from not understanding, and so. Getting some understanding around both of these things, and understanding that you can dip your toe in the water with a share market at least, and not have it. You don't have to throw all your money at it. And you need to realize that your super is actually a share market. You are invested in the share market, so you're actually, without realizing it, you are all share market investors. So that's another thing to consider. And so it's always good to find out a little bit more about where your money's going. So
absolutely.
And it does depend. But look, in an ideal world, it'd be great. We could all have an investment property and some shares and some super. That would be great. But reality bites, and it's not necessarily a doable thing. So be careful. Don't take on too much debt. That's my number one take out of all this.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, Nicole, thank you as always. It's absolutely fantastic to have you on and dipping our toe in the water on this one, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks, Michael. Me too.
Bye.
Bye.